satellites? A satellite represents a journey, information gathering, this journey around the Earth.
We started having these conversations, what we said like 35 years ago or something.
Yeah.
And I remember, so my parents had, my parents had bought a Volkswagen van again from Baba, it's from the neighbor. And then my mom had a Honda Accord. And you and I were we were looking at the air conditioning controls, like the user interface of the Honda versus the Volkswagen. And I said, weird, like unless there's like a patent on it, why does Volkswagen have like Honda had a dial that turned the fan from 1 to 4, and then a button in the middle that was AC on or off.
Yeah.
And VW had this like crazy thing where you had to be like air conditioning on the defrost, air conditioning for the people, it was like this. We had like 12 extra steps built into the user interface.
That's what I'm saying. That's German engineering, I think that once you graduate to, like back then, again, having a BMW was a luxury. And so I think when you owned a BMW, maybe you were given sort of the secret knowledge of all of that stuff in the car, because all those incomprehensible icons, the different combinations of buttons and knobs and dials you had to turn to do each thing. Yeah. You know what's funny is like I noticed some years ago somebody said to me that the electrical systems in German cars in general, they're like that's one of their weaknesses. Yeah. And sometime after somebody told me that, I started to notice how many Volkswagens and BMWs I would see driving around with a missing headlight, like with a headlight that was out. And I thought, I wonder if those two things are connected. But yeah, I think just all of those combos that you had to do I think they've resolved that now. I think that, I don't think user interface design was really a thing back then. Like the idea of usability and all that. I think that came later.
Well, one thing, so my wife's family, I'm here in Bogota. Yeah. And my wife's family, they've had a BMW for many years, and they traded in their old model and got a new electric one. And it's like an SUV. And it's top of the line and has all the bells and whistles.
Electric BMW.
Fully electric.
You know what I love about those? They because they don't need a grill. BMW has that very distinctive grill. Yeah. And so when they decided they wanted to have electric BMWs, obviously they had to figure out what to do with their iconic sort of distinctive grill. So they thought, let's just paint one on. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
It's like a graphic of a grill.
Last year's model was so ugly. It literally was. It had this diamond shape with like weird kind of shiny on one side and not on the, and I was like, why do that? And
that was somebody's job, because they were like, they probably designed it with like a flat front, like a lot of electric vehicles.
Yeah,
just
like the Volvo, it's gorgeous.
Like a monochrome front, right? And then they looked at it and said, it just doesn't look like a BMW, because we always have that little split grill thing. So let's just paint one on. And they hired like a graphic designer to paint. And they came up with a diamond pattern.
So downstairs in the the sort of underground parking lot, I've been coming here for years for Christmas, and there's a neighbor who has the i3, which is like, I think one of their first EVs. Like
they don't make it anymore, the little one. Yeah, I love that one.
Really pretty, and it's so pretty. And I went and took a picture of the front, and I was like, oh, it's so pretty. And then the neighbor he has it parked there, and he bought the new model from last year, and it has that painted on grill. Yeah. And it's just ugly. I mean, it's so ugly. But then
even that first one, the i3, because after the new one came out, and I wanted to know, like, what did they do with the grill on that one? And it's like a window. It's like a clear plastic. It's still a strange solution, but it looks fine when you see one. But it's not as ugly as the painted thing.
They were like, Steve Jobs Johnny Ive got away with the clear iMac. Remember like that? They're like, let's do that. Let's show them the motor. Something like. Right. But so my brother-in-law got the new one. It's brand new. And it doesn't have the really ugly painted on grill. It does have sort of a grill, but it's much more petite and dark. So it just looks kind of like a air vent or something.
I think one thing they did was with the gasoline models, the recent generation of BMW gas cars or internal combustion cars, they increased the size of the grill. They made it really big. So then I think that they were stuck with the electric ones. They were like, oh, we just blew up the grill like on all our cars, and now we have to introduce these electric ones. So they were like in this weird trap that they set for themselves.
It is funny how like these design trends happen. Like, right, my wife had been looking for a new car for the last couple of years, and she was stopped by the fact that during the pandemic you couldn't get enough chips, and so there weren't any cars. But she did sit in a few, and she's 5 foot, barely 5'1", right? And there's this trend, like you said, BMW sort of almost like they made the hood parallel to the ground. Like it used to kind of slope down, a little bit. Now it's like, so when she sits in a car, it's like she cannot see.
No, it's like being in a cargo ship or something where you can't see like a mile in front of you, right?
Yeah. If we took pictures of her,
like let's make the blind spot like let's make the blind spot a little bigger.
Like 30% of your front view is missing because and you're like, why? But anyways, but that is a weird trend that they like the hoods just kept coming up and up and up. And so anyway, okay, so back to this thing. So we were talking about my mom had a Honda Accord and my dad had this Vanagon. The other thing I loved that the Honda had, which I think it disappeared, but it was this one vertical switch that had a blue face or a body shape without a blue face. And the blue face meant you could put vent just on your face and have heat on your legs, which in Pennsylvania is kind of nice. Like if you want your feet are cold, you want to like have hot air blowing on your feet.
That's such an edge case.
You have to open the windows, right? You have to open the windows to get that sort of like fresh air feel.
But then you have the noise, the traffic noise.
The blue face was like, it was like a little icon of a person.
I don't remember that.
Well,
I had a Honda back then too. It wasn't as new. Yours was newer, but I don't remember the blue face.
Yours was green, and it was a really cool green color. It was like
I had a series of Hondas. I had like that forest green '77 Civic wagon with a manual choke. Like that was pretty old.
That was your dad's. You inherited that from your dad.
I inherited it from him, and then I bought a 1980 Civic wagon that was like a maroon color. So it was a little newer.
Oh yeah, I don't really remember that one. But.
Yeah, I burned out the transmission on that because I used to drive to I was dating a girl that lived in Pittsburgh. So I would drive across Pennsylvania at like literally with the foot, they say foot to the floor. In the 1980 Honda Civic wagon, if your foot was to the floor, like you barely did 85, right? So I would have my foot pinned to the floor, the accelerator, and I would be doing 85 across Pennsylvania. And, at like 5,000 RPMs. And it died. And then it was, it's one of those things when you have an old car and then you're faced with a repair bill for something that's like, do I spend $2,000 on fixing this car? Or do I spend $3,000 on a new car, on another used car? But you don't, in those days, having another $1,000 was a lot of extra money. So it's like, I guess I'll just do the 2,000 to rebuild the tranny.
I remember I had, well, first of all, that green Civic.
Yeah.
I remember one time, and now that I'm going to be a grandfather, I hope my grandchild doesn't get, bad influence by this. But I remember one time, we had this weird thing where we would drop people at the airport or pick them up.
Oh yeah.
And we would try to go all the way from the airport to the house without touching the brakes. Was that what it was? Yeah,
that was a challenge. Somebody like dared me to do that, or maybe I came up with it. I don't know. But yeah, I would try to go all the way from the airport back home without ever touching the brakes. And like, it was tricky once you get off the freeway, right?
Yeah,
and so,
sure.
But the thing, the saving grace was the manual transmission, right? Like you could downshift like crazy, but then there would always be those long stoplight situations where it's like, oh, is it going to turn green before I creep up to that car?
And I do remember, I don't think, how people post on social media, like a video that incriminates them. I think we're in the statute of limitations has passed, but I do remember we were on I-95, kind of coming through sort of that downtown South Philly area, and maybe a little bit north of there. And this person was in the lane, and they were going way too slow in the left lane, and so you just passed them on the shoulder, without touching your brakes. And I remember being like, whoa, Sean is such a good driver.
No, I used to do I mean, when I see drivers do things that I did back then, I get so angry now. And then I remember doing some of those same things. Like I was painting my uncle's place in Trenton. And so that drive to Trenton, I would try to break my record on how fast I could get to Trenton. And I'd be weaving in and out of traffic like an asshole. And I think about, like, when you say, your grandkid, I hope I'm not a bad influence. Like, one of the things I remember talking to my little brother, because he's 15 years younger than me. So he was like a kid when I was, a young grown up, he was a kid. And I remember when he was coming up to driving age, and I sat him down, and the same thing when I think about my kids driving, and God, I hope they don't do, because my dad used to have the same talk with me. He would say, you never know if you're driving through a parking lot, somebody could step out from between, you gotta always, but it just didn't stick with me in a way. Like you're young and you just kind of think, well, that would never happen to me. I would hit the brakes. Like, I'm good at this. Right. So you just kind of had this ego.
And later I remember reading about the frontal lobe, which governs like risk assessment.
The prefrontal cortex, right? Yeah,
prefrontal cortex and the empathy. And I feel like it doesn't really stop growing until like 26 years old.
Yeah.
So when my dad would yell, like my dad would give me the same lecture. Like, he'd be like, "You're flying through the neighborhood if a kid on a tricycle just slides out in front of you." And I'd be like, "Why would they do that? Like, they shouldn't do that. Like,
yeah.
It's a road, and I couldn't like empathize with them. And so I feel like in some ways,
well, it's empathy. It's also just like the inability to understand like actions and consequences. Like that's also in the prefrontal cortex. Yeah, the idea of imagining hypothetical future consequences to your actions now and things like that. Yeah.
And I remember like parents, like your dad and my dad, like they were like frustrated with us, but I don't think we had like, the motherboard hadn't been built out yet. Like there wasn't enough like infrastructure to actually do what they wanted. My dad's big thing was, it's kind of like, it's weird segue, but like I remember we had a lacrosse coach that used to just shout, "Concentrate." I was like a really spacey guy. Like I just get kind of bored.
Yeah. It worked, right? When he said concentrate.
I was just like, why does I just kept thinking like, why does he keep saying that? Like, I don't, like, what does he want us to do? Like, I'm playing the game.
What does he want us to do? Exactly. Like, what does that mean? What am I not doing?
Yeah. Totally. Like, but it's the same thing. It's like I can totally picture, like, and I do remember being really spacey in sports. Like if there was any kind of thing where you had to wait and like the ball was in play downfield and you were a defenseman or something, let's say, or like I was a front guy in lacrosse and I was just waiting for the ball to come upfield and I would start thinking about things and all of a sudden the ball would come flying by and I'd be like, and I'd catch it and someone would just nail me.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, darn. And that's what I think he meant was he was looking at me and being like, this kid is out to lunch.
It's funny because as you said that, I was thinking about my experience coaching youth baseball, right? And so these little kids, especially back in like when they were second, third grade, pretty young. And the number of times I would say things like, hey, Leo, stand up. or, Alex, put your glove back on. Right? Like they'd be sitting in the grass in the outfield, like plucking flowers or whatever, right? Plucking dandelions. Totally. Like, dude, stand up.
So it wasn't just me.
At least look like you're playing a sport.
It wasn't just me, right?
No. But it's funny. It's very like concentrate. I remember that too. Like, what? It's kind of like I don't know. The other thing I thought of is telling people to calm down. Like, especially telling kids to calm down. Like, calm down doesn't work. I mentioned this in a previous podcast. Like, telling somebody to calm down is guaranteed not to work for any human on the planet, but especially for kids, like who don't have that prefrontal cortex.
It's like you've been to meditation seminars where, the person says like, empty your mind of thoughts. Oh my God. My mom recently said like, I've tried meditating, but I can't stop thinking. And I said, well, the Buddhists that I hung out with, they said, the Tibetan Buddhism said like, no, because it's tantric, like you're supposed to say, wow, the mind is racing. And then you just pull back and say, look at that mind that's racing. Mm-hmm. And that's separating yourself from that kind of crazy stuff. And I was like, so really you can celebrate the fact that you can't stop thinking, because you can then see yourself not being able to stop thinking. And once you've done that, you've made that shift,
Yeah.
or started to.
Well, and it's funny because like, I mean, I've meditated now for years, right? So like I will go from that space where you see your thoughts, where you can recognize your thoughts, where you're observing your thoughts. And then sometimes I will, as I pull back, enter the no thought space.
Yeah, totally.
And the way I always come out of it is like, holy shit, I have no thoughts. Oh, damn.
Exactly. But it's that's sort of what you're trying to do is go backstage, like Baba Muktananda's Play of Consciousness book, he really does use this theatrical idea that your life is a stage, and there's a backstage. And like, I often think like you can go backstage and you can call your agent. You can be like, this place sucks. I hate the script. The other actors aren't committed. Get me a different gig. Like, you know what I mean? Sort of, there's that place where you can go that's not immediate sort of,
Someone else described it as like normal life is like walking through a huge house full of rooms, right? Yeah. And then deep meditation, I think he was talking about psychedelics, but he also said, deep meditation kind of can do this too. It's like being vaulted through the roof of the house, and you're suddenly like, oh, I can see the whole house.
Oh, yeah,
like
that's cool. Yeah.
And so I thought that was a cool metaphor too.
That's very cool. Yeah. And sort of the power of 10, like you could see the house, then the country, then the earth, the continent, the earth, and then you can see, whoa, that is pretty wild. And I mean, I've never done, what's that, DMT? I've never done that, but
I've never done that either. DMT is what's in ayahuasca too, but the toad venom, like the straight DMT, it's a different form of DMT. That's the one you're talking about, right?
Yeah, and it's super quick. It's like a 7-minute.
It's like LDMT or L-DMT or something like that. I can't remember.
And again, I'm not like a chemist, but it is something that's released when we're born and when we die. Like there's something about, we make it ourselves and we have this. But anyway, the experience is exactly that. You're supposedly vaulted like at 1,000 miles an hour backward out of your tiny brain into the star system.
Yeah.
And then you collapse back into yourself.
And it's super quick.
Experience. Super quick. And you have this experience that like, damn, I'm just a bunch of electrons that happen to like get stuck in this little eddy, in this whirlpool.
Right. Like you're thrown into a timeless, spaceless existence for just a brief bit. And I guess, I don't know, that makes me think of the paradox of, and maybe this is what you're saying with DMT, when we make it, when we die. I don't necessarily like to kind of have a mechanistic explanation for like near-death experiences. It's just DMT or whatever. But with near-death experiences, sometimes people report being in a place without time, where time ceases to exist. And what's interesting is they will just come back and describe like a sequence, which implies time, like it implies time exists, because they'll say this happened and then this happened and then this happened. Right. And at the same time, they're saying, but time didn't exist. And so I've heard people kind of be asked about that paradox. Like, well, you just said time doesn't exist, and now you're describing a sequence. And they say, it's just impossible to describe in language, right? And it's super fascinating.
It is. I have a funny story. So my ex-wife's grandfather, Leon Rhodes, he was the president of the Near-Death Experience Society. And what they did was they just documented people who claimed to have had near-death experiences. They documented they would interview them. Mm-hmm. And so they would have it was scientific, or academic. They were trying to, what are the commonalities in an experience? A lot of times people say a long dark tunnel with a light at the end, a great feeling of warmth and goodness. Anyway, so we went up. We were up in New York, working up there, and he came up to give a lecture, or I guess have a meeting. So all of these, you can imagine these people that show up. This dude comes in and he's like, okay, I want to share my near-death experience. So he goes, I was riding along my motorcycle up in Maine. I crashed and I landed in the mud face down, and my helmet was completely buried into the soft mud. And I was just suspended there inside the helmet until the paramedics turned me over. And then Leon was kind of like, that sounds like a really intense experience, but what
I was
not,
waiting for you to go somewhere else.
but what I'm not hearing are these sort of common things like,
Yeah.
I passed into another place. I saw because really you were inside your helmet because you were in the mud. And there's nothing about that that's sort of abnormal. That all of us would say, face in the
It's
mud.
like saying, "Oh, I had this near-death experience. I was in my neighborhood, and I was about to cross the street, and just as I stepped into the street, a car like just flew by, and like if I had just stepped into the street a second earlier, I would have been killed. So that's my near-death experience."
Exactly. And by the way, because I have my own sort of non-near death, so I was riding my bike up 6th Avenue, right by Moondance Diner, right by Canal and
Yeah.
Sixth. So that's where it starts. So like
Moondance Diner, rest in peace. I think it's gone, right?
Yeah, it's gone. I think it's gone. But but I was riding my bike on 6th Avenue, and that there's one weird entrance to the Holland Tunnel from that spot. Like you can sort of make a left and curve around, and there's like 8 ways to get to the Holland Tunnel. So I was riding, and this like mini truck, one of those like short trucks, like a rider truck, it came so close to my right elbow that the mirror banged my elbow. Ooh. And then he swerved left in front of me to go to the Holland Tunnel. And on the back of the mini truck, where all that soot, like that soot builds up, someone had written an arrow to the left that said live, and an arrow to the right that said die.
Oh shit.
And I was on the live side, and I was like, this guy, first of all, he's a terrible driver.
Yeah.
He kind of tried to run over me, but didn't quite get there. Like he certainly like turned just in front of me on my bike and sort of banged my elbow, Wow. Anyway, so that's my face down in the mud, motorcycle helmet near death.
So I want to comment on, I want to add something to that, or I want to kind of continue that, but I want to say Happy New Year, Milo.
Happy New
Satellite
Year.
Haiku.
This is Satellite Haiku. This is great.
Yeah, I wanted to say, so what you were saying about that van clipping you, right? Yeah. So I hear ex-evangelicals sometimes talk about like the church trauma and the things they still think about, like the rapture and stuff that still sort of like sits with them and freaks them out. One thing, I don't know if this is your experience, but one thing from I don't have many of those from our church upbringing. Our church was pretty mellow as churches go, I think. Like we weren't a church that was very focused on evangelizing people and all that stuff. But one of the things I do remember that still sits with me sometimes is that idea that when you die, you wake up in the spiritual world and you don't know that you've died, right? And so there's this, especially if you've died suddenly, right? So there's this whole process. The idea, what we were taught was there's this whole process where you sort of learn that you have died, right? And there's a lot of movies and stuff based on that sort of premise.
Jacob's Ladder,
that's the first one I was thinking of, right? So the idea was that, they would tell us these stories about how you would die and you would wake up in the spiritual world, and then like a new friend might come into your life, and that person was like your guide, basically your person who was supposed to gently introduce you to the fact that you've died, right? So I remember learning that back then, and that was supposed to be this very comforting thing, right? Like you wake up gently, you learn that, but I swear, every time I had an experience like that, where like a car nearly missed me or something, and I would always, for days after, sometimes weeks after, I'd think, maybe I died actually. And like anytime something weird happened, or if I met somebody new or whatever, I would say like, oh, that time when I was crossing the street and I didn't see that car till the last second, I bet I actually got killed by that car. And here I am, right? Yeah. And I still have that sometimes pop into my head. Like I still have that thing where I'm like, oh, maybe I did die. That scares the shit out of me.
It's funny that you bring that up. First of all, I think we should tell our listeners who didn't grow up. We grew up in a Swedenborgian community, and Emanuel Swedenborg was a scientist in the 1770s, published 40 volumes in Sweden, in Latin. He published them. And so it's a very odd religion. In many ways, there are, I often say that it's Christian. The shell of the car, the body of the car is Christian. But if you lift the hood and look at the engine, it's non-dualist. Mm-hmm. because he really does say like in, divine love and wisdom, like everything, and there's like not really a hell or
Well, it's
devils.
kind of weird that the church that was established around his work is kind of, it's kind of bizarre that exists at all in a way, because
But there's quotes where he says, "Do not create an organized religion based on my writings."
right. So basically what they did with that is they said, hey, let's create an organized religion and we'll clone the Episcopalian church. We'll make it really like the old school Anglican church, not even the new, like they're not even like the Episcopalian church has actually evolved quite a bit, but the Swedenborgian, like the new church we grew up in, is still like, no, only men can be ministers. Like it's this very weird, you're right. It's like the shell that they've built is so strange, and actually it's actually the opposite of strange. It's so exactly like old school Christian churches. And then under the hood is this very strange set of mystical kind of spiritual writings by Swedenborg, who claimed that he was simultaneously living in the spiritual world and this natural world, and so he was writing down his experiences of traveling through the spiritual world, essentially, right?
Yeah, and if I were to give, I've tried to come up with like an elevator pitch or like the back of a business card pitch. Like I would say the books, the 40 volumes, there's maybe 50% of it is ultra dense, didactic, arguing with philosophers of the day to make a point.
Right. There were like 20 volumes of the Arcana Celestia, which is like the sort of the encoded. It's like the code of the Bible, right? The Arcana Celestia, isn't that the secrets of heaven, right? And
exactly, yeah. And it's meant to be like sort of interpreting all of the stories from the Bible as symbolism.
And that's the one. That's the really didactic, really technical set of stuff that you're kind of referring to, right?
Yeah, and then the other sort of, I'll call half, are these mystical experiences where he describes traveling in other worlds, like, spiritual world, the heavens, the hells, all these other planets, which are super trippy. And it's kind of hard to reconcile. It's hard to reconcile like the sort of very conservative version of the church that we grew up in. And we should say that there are many versions around the world of Swedenborgian churches. Some of them are much more liberal. Yeah. But the one we grew up in is like ultra orthodox, and they're like so. And it's so hard to imagine some of these like super conservative folks reading like, and then I went to Mars and I talked to these, it's just so bizarre. Like,
Well, I remember asking about like, because when we first encountered that book, the book where he claims to have traveled to or visited spirits from other planets.
I think it's the Spiritual Diary or Earths in the Universe.
Earths in the Universe. Yeah. And the Spiritual Diary, like he had the Spiritual Diary or whatever, Spiritual Journals or something. But yeah, I remember when we first encountered that and asking like our religion teacher, like, what's the deal with this one? And they definitely tried to sort of sweep that one aside. Like, oh yeah, that's definitely that. Yeah. We're not really sure what to do with that was kind of the gist of it. Right. Like they sort of pretended that one didn't exist. The thing I was talking to, actually, I have a friend out here and we've talked about Swedenborg quite a bit. Actually, he's a really interesting guy. He was an Army. He went to West Point. He was an Army Ranger. He's the one who introduced me to ayahuasca. Oh, super interesting dude. He's got a church now called Souls. It's super interesting. He leads ceremonies and does a lot of really interesting spiritual work. But I get to see him from time to time. A really good friend out here, and he's fascinated. I mean, he's very interested in Swedenborg, and we've talked about some of these things. But one of the things that I revisited fairly recently was the book Divine Providence.
Yeah,
because one of the things now I'm not religious at all anymore. But one of the things I remember sort of appreciating about those teachings about divine providence is because one of the things that differentiates that church, I said just a little bit ago, is how it never really focused on evangelizing people. And I think with a lot of Christian churches, some of the people who start to question the church, one of the sort of the avenues of questioning is, well, what happens to these people who've never been exposed to the church? Like if you're born into some indigenous culture in some other part of the world, and I mean, this is what colonization was, right? It was like bringing Christianity to these people so you could save them, right?
Save them, yeah.
And so that's based on this idea that like, oh, they're going to go to hell unless we can kind of get to them, right? And so the the Swedenborgian church didn't do that at all and didn't believe in that at all. And so I thought that was kind of fascinating and ahead of its time in a way. And the way that divine providence explained that, and I don't know, maybe you remember it differently, but is that essentially the idea was that pretty much your actions are, there was this notion of your split between your works and your beliefs, right? Your faith and your beliefs, or your beliefs with your faith and your belief and your actions, right? Faith and charity, we would call it, or faith and works or whatever. And so if you didn't have the sort of the toolkit of the right beliefs, the correct beliefs or whatever, the Christian beliefs that we were taught, then your works themselves, if you were just a good person in the world, that was plenty. Like you were saved based on that. Yeah. And then you were given the beliefs later after you died or whatever. If so that was their way of sort of explaining that we don't need to reach those people. We don't need to convert those people or colonize those people. If they're good people, God will save them. And then we can kind of work on their teachings later after they're, in this spiritual world or whatever. And so the other way they resolved that was this sort of tiered system of heaven, right? Like, they'll make it into the lowest level of heaven, and as they get taught. But then also you were more accountable. Like if you knew the doctrines, so to speak, then you could make it into the highest tier of heaven right after you died, but you were more accountable because you had more to sort of like comply with. But so, and then the other thing about divine providence was just that the arc of the universe bending towards good, right? It was also the church's way of explaining, like, why do bad things happen, right? And so I actually was thinking about that more recently, like, because I never really was satisfied with the idea that, like, if children are suffering in the world or whatever, and God is sort of like, well, you think about what's happening again in Gaza, right? You think of like people going through hell on earth, and it's really hard to believe that a God would allow that, right? Like a merciful God would allow that when a merciful God could stop it, right? And so the divine providence explanation always seemed a little weak to me. But as I started to think about it, like even 100 years of suffering, if you did believe in God, compared to eternity, is the same as zero suffering, right? So anyway. Yeah,
I see your point. I did want to go back to, because you were talking about the trauma of having grown up in this Swedenborgian religion, and this idea that you were sort of softly, kind of like someone coming up to you if you've been adopted, and they're like, you're 21 now. I just have to say you were adopted. Like it's almost like this like life-changing moment, but it's also done very sweetly. Anyway, so I had that same. I like had panic attacks when I was a kid. I was sort of very, very sensitive to like Cold War things. I couldn't watch like The Day After or something, or I'd have nightmares for 7 weeks. But anyway, I remember we used to play this game with my older cousin Kevin, and we would sneak into each other. We'd break into each other's cars, like we used the little thing on the window, and then we'd pull the person's distributor cable so that and we'd lock the car and close it up, and then I
remember doing that. We did that with teachers too, right? Sometimes
we did it with which is like a thing. So I remember once Kevin did it to me, or someone did it to me, and I was in that courtyard of my, the church that I grew up in that had that beautiful French courtyard with cobblestones, and it was raining, and there was a big puddle. And I loved to go around with bare feet. Like I felt like it was this, I don't know why, I just loved having bare feet and going everywhere with bare feet. It felt very hippie or something. But I remember going and opening my hood, and I had my left hand on the hood.
Oh no.
And I went to push the distributor cap back on. Yeah. And it's 12 volts.
Yeah.
It's a lot of hands
right there, right? Yeah.
And I was standing in the water, like both feet in the water. Barefoot. And it gave me a really wicked shock across the arms. I closed the hood, and I sat in my car thinking, I'm dead. Someone's going to come up to me. And I kept like everyone that I drove to like the 7-Eleven, and I was like bought a candy bar, and I was like, it tastes really good. Right. And I remember like biting my lip, and I'd be like, I don't think my lip would hurt if I was in heaven. I remember like trying different,
like testing it out. Like, what if I punched myself right now?
And I actually had this one rationale where I said, I'm having a panic attack and my heart's beating this fast. And if I was really dead, according to the story, I wouldn't be panicking. So I must be alive because I'm so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That was kind of a weird proof.
That's some good logic. Yeah. Yeah. I used to hate that.
It's weird, right? It's funny that we
Super
can
weird.
be. I love that you used the word trauma. Like it was this, because we heard the story or we heard the description.
Yeah.
And then we just like went around like worried about it for the
Yeah. And we don't have the trauma that I hear from ex-evangelicals, which is, like about like serious guilt and stuff, right? Like that God is watching and you're, you have all these sort of rules you have to comply with, or you're going to go straight to hell and stuff like that. Like we don't have that kind of trauma, but we have some weird ones.
Yeah. I do have a relative who would tell you they like left the church like back in high school because they read Conjugal Love, and there was a whole thing about having sex before marriage and that you were a harlot, and they were traumatized by that and never looked back. Like they just were like, it was just brutal for them, and so they felt like it kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater in a way. Yeah. I personally think as artists and writers and creative people, there's like a rich fabric to pull on from a lot of those stories and a lot of the concepts, and it's really pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Conjugal Love was an interesting one because, like, one of the things that took me kind of, I guess, what sort of started my journey out of the church was thinking about that as I started to meet more gay people, right, and more people from that community, and thinking like what we were taught about homosexuality, and then encountering, it was like taught to us as this grievous sin, right? And then you meet people and you realize, like, I didn't have gay friends back then, except very closeted ones, right? Because I can think of who they are now, and some of them came out later. I mean, more of them may have than I know, but I know of some that did, that were closeted gay friends, because you had to be in the closet in that community back then. But yeah, I mean, just meeting people in New York and whatnot, and kind of having it dawn on me that, oh, it's ridiculous that this was taught as a sin. Like this is just people loving people differently than I love people, and, living a different life. And kind of, I remember sort of going through that and having that be one of the things that spurred more questioning. Like I was already kind of on my way out of the church at that point. I wasn't really a church goer, but in terms of, like, I hung on to a lot of beliefs for a long time and shed them in layers. Like, I definitely peeled them off in layers. Like I remember thinking at various times in my life, like, oh, I've kind of shed the church. And then I'd sort of encounter one more weird prejudice in myself, or sort of a fear in myself or whatever. And I go, oh, that's another church thing that, here, let me look at that one.
One thing, what I like in what you were describing there, I've gone through a lot of that myself. And one thing I heard, and that's important to me, is to recognize that the organized church that we grew up in, which is a far right now organization in a particular place and time, versus Swedenborg's over 300 years old writings that are pretty, one thing I did, and my point is this, that I think 2 years ago, I was with my parents and I asked them about, does Swedenborg even mention homosexuality? And so we went on like a little dive together just to look at like other, theologians that have done research, and he doesn't ever say anything like you shouldn't be gay. Yeah. He does talk about like the symbolic connection between the feminine and the masculine. Right. But that I could say polarity is a huge thing. Like, even with lesbian couples, like polarity with gay, absolutely. Like, more like about that than.
I was thinking about that recently. I was wondering, that's so, yeah, I'd love to hear kind of what you found, because even with Conjugal Love, when I was thinking about maybe its language around man and woman, like if you went back to the Latin, would it be, marriage between a man and woman, blah, blah, blah. Like that book is really focused on that in particular, but I wonder how much you could, like if you went back to his direct thoughts and, the Latin that he wrote maybe at the time, and Latin's probably too limited a language maybe, but it occurred to me that maybe you could argue that he was talking about feminine and masculine in more abstract kind of as qualities rather than, specifically men and women. So anyway, yeah. Continue.
No, and it's an interesting question because so one thing is that in Hillwright, I went back because remember like the story in the Bible where like Moses goes up on the mountain and like the Lord writes the Ten Commandments on a rock with his finger. Like that's pretty clear. Like you pretty much like you like you get out the Dremel tool and you just write those things on the rock, right? And that's straight hand of God, right?
Yeah.
So that I think I grew up for a long time thinking that Swedenborg, like the Lord picked up his hand and wrote 40 volumes of work.
Yeah.
But then I read I read 3 of his biographies when I was about 20, 28. And the dude is like constantly questioning himself. He's like, living in this time where it's heretical, he was almost burned at the stake. The only reason he was saved was the king of Sweden said, this dude is the minister of mining. And he has created like ore, refining techniques that are like invaluable to Sweden. So like, he's weird, but don't kill him,
Yeah.
And so like he would say, he would go back and like Apocalypse Explained, he didn't publish it. And then he went back and like deleted half of each paragraph and rewrote it. And he was like constantly like worried, and he would say things like, I'm supposed to be writing this document that is an sort of like a foil or a what's the word? It's like something like a hologram of something that exists on another plane.
Yeah.
And mine is flawed. It has anachronisms, it has cultural bias, it has like all of these things. Like I'm a white dude in Northern Europe in 1772. Like he recognized that how flawed that perspective and how vast the truth that he was trying to copy down or write out was flawed by his minuscule perspective, which I think is an interesting way to look at it.
It's interesting to think of him as recognizing or just having that self-awareness of his own cultural kind of limitations. So you feel like that he did?
He for sure. And also the part of the sort of schism church that I grew up in, because there was multiple, it's like a church that likes to schism off, partly because he said, don't make an organized religion based on my works.
Yeah.
So they tended to to break apart.
Right. Like the people would be like, hey, this was never what was and then they'd split off and make their own.
Yeah. So, and the one that I grew up in, his works are considered the third testament of the Bible.
Yeah.
And that since he interpreted or like dug into, decoded these earlier stories, so it is possible to decode and repurpose his work in that same kind of way. So in other words, like that there's an internal, like use the term,
there's an internal sense. There's a set of correspondences that could be found in his work. Interesting. Was there in the branch of the Swedenborgian church that you were in, were there writings that were attempting to decode it in the same way, or was it kind of left to the future? Like someday it will be revealed to somebody and they will write the code of the internal sense of Swedenborg.
I think the latter, but I think simply the claim that it was possible.
Yeah.
It turned a lot of ire, and like my grandfather was one of the sort of early leaders of that schism church.
Yeah.
And people would sort of accuse him of thinking that he was like, an Illuminati, or what's the word? Like an enlightened being.
Yeah.
For even trying to do it,
So that was the heresy that, you can't claim that you are, this, you're putting yourself into this category of.
Right. And so I'm not so sure like that anyone came out and published a book and said, I've done it. I've interpreted Swedenborg's writings myself, because it was kind of like, it was a very hot topic, but the idea that they had this big, the premise was that it could be done, and that it would be done and is being done, kind of like, is really interesting.
Is anyone in your family still, connected with the church or like sort of committed to the church at all?
No, my dad had a midlife crisis and became a minister, but he was always much more interested in the administrative kind of organizational aspects. Like he wasn't really like a philosophy guy.
Right. You've told me stories of your dad sort of being bothered by the politics of the church, or the way it
Yeah.
was run, not just the politics, but the competence of people and things like that, right? Like,
Right. And how
yeah,
they organize themselves and their budgets. And
yeah,
one thing that I wanted to ask my mom, because um, she grew up, her father was the bishop of this schism church. And so I said, Mom, do you still, believe everything that you read in Swedenborg and that you were taught when you were growing up? And she said, she thought for a long time. My mom's 80.
mm-hmm.
And she said, your dad and I have decided that we want to be not planted without a coffin.
Yeah.
And that your dad wants to be an oak tree and I want to become an elm. And I thought that was a sweet way.
I love that indirect answer. Yeah.
She didn't say like it's all bullshit. She just said like, at the end of the day, like I know that my physical body will be repurposed, with carbon chains. Yeah. And I'd like to become an elm tree and your dad wants to become an oak tree. I thought that was a very sweet way to
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. In Sweden, in San Francisco here, there is a pretty well-known Swedenborgian church. It's the Convention Church, I think. It's another one of those schisms, right? It's the most liberal one, or it's the biggest liberal, very liberal one. What's that?
Is it the glass one?
It's the Arts and Crafts building. So it's like this beautiful wood building.
Okay.
Arts and crafts style architecture. And my dad and his wife used to come down here from Portland, where they lived. They would drive down and they would go to retreats that were sort of organized by that church, and they would spend time going to that church. And we had a memorial for my dad at that church here in San Francisco. And, they had some, so they continued to be, part of it and my dad would always try to get me, because I live in San Francisco, so I never really went to church there, but he would always try to pitch me on, very boomer style, like, they have, they have 2 gay people in the choir. So, they're very liberal. Right. So that was my dad's attempt to pitch me, it's sort of that weirdly offensive way of, how boomers, like, they'll just call out people's race or their sexual orientation in totally arbitrary ways when they're telling a story. Right. So, so anyway, that my dad would try to pitch me on going there, and I never really went, but, so they were still connected. And when you mentioned your mom and kind of what she said about when she dies, I remember when my dad was diagnosed with cancer and it was untreatable, and he knew he was kind of on a timeline. The clock was ticking, right? And I visited him a few times, and I asked him about just whether he was afraid or whether he felt fear. And the church definitely gave him real comfort. Like, my dad was he was not like a deeply intellectual guy. I'll just say that. He was an artist, right? And so I think that it's cool that he was able to find so much comfort in what he understood about life after death and things like that. So I think those, the church for him was a huge comfort. But yeah, nobody else in my life is a church going person with the Swedenborg Church. I mean, nobody I'm close to here. And my wife's family's Catholic. Some more than others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's interesting for me is, I've always been curious into, like, since I left college, where we had done a lot, like a deep dive, our freshman and sophomore years, we actually had to take religion classes. And that's where we read those philosophical books like Divine Love and Wisdom, Divine Providence. And, but the whole concept of a creation model and a belief system, looking back across the last 10,000 years, like it's clear that humans find comfort in explaining the things that they don't understand, all the uncertainties about life, by creating like a spiritual structure that can like explain all the unexplainable things. Mm-hmm. And like, where do you go after you die? Who was here? Like they come up with a lot of times a Godhead figure, seems to be very comforting to people. And so I look at it and say, kind of like the placebo drift idea, is that like, placebo drift, where placebos worked in those early 70s studies, like 23% of the time. Yeah. But over the decades, as you did blind placebo studies, they work more. They're more efficacious because people think, if I do get the sugar pill, 30% of the time it works. So then it will, Like there's this sort of
Yeah.
And the drift shows us that our superstitions are powerful and actually have real ramifications for our health, for our mental health, you know? So I look at it that way. And I think like the part of me that wants all of those things to be true can find comfort in them. But there's a very empirical, didactic part of me that thinks I'm just carbon chains for 78 years on average.
Yeah.
And then I'm not neither created nor destroyed. I'm stardust. You know, I think we talked about this in another episode where like we feel like we're the constant, but to the stardust that is us, we're just this weird variant that popped up and got really attached to like being us for 78 years, you know?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, like I run away from the word just a little bit because it feels like an assertion. And I guess I just think of it as a mystery. Like, I don't know what we are. Right. So I feel like, you know, I've experienced some things, you know, just those moments of meditation, which I described, where you're in that moment of no thoughts and no time. And you arrive there for a second and you know, I jettison out of it as soon as I realize I'm there. But definitely on psychedelics, right, on ayahuasca, you know, experiencing things where everything I understand about myself, or, you know, everything I thought I understood about myself and the world just goes away and I'm still there somehow. Right. And so I think there's part of me that thinks, you know, consciousness is deeper than all of this stuff. And who knows, right? And so that's when I think of life after death and things like that. I just think of the mystery, right? And I think of like, we are right now in these limited human bodies and limited human brains. And it makes sense that we try to formulate stories to explain the stuff we don't understand. But ultimately, whatever stories we're able to formulate are being formulated through our limited human brains, and they are limited by our human bodies. And I even think about how that plays out in the natural world. Like I always talk about like, well, what a honeybee sees or a jellyfish, right? Like we talk about the natural world and we think about light and sound and things like that. But what a honeybee experiences as it flies through the natural world is entirely different. And so like we have this weird bias where we think we see the world, but we only see this tiny little sliver of even the natural world, right? Like all these other organisms on Earth experience just the natural world in a completely different way than we do. And so it just reminds me of how limited my brain and my body is, and my ability to understand things like consciousness, you know, or even if I have experienced something where I felt like, wow, I think I am understanding what consciousness is. When I sort of come back to my body, I can't put that into words, right? Like these words are even more limited than my body is, right? So it's kind of, I guess I had these Jehovah's Witnesses come to my door one time and they were trying to pitch their little, hey, don't you want to know the truth? And my answer to them was, not really. Like, I'm kind of comfortable with the mystery. You know, like and what I meant was like, I don't think any of us can understand the truth in these limited bodies and limited brains. Like whatever the truth is far beyond my capacity to even comprehend it, to even grasp it. So I said to them, you know, like, I'm not really, I'm actually pretty comfortable just having it all be a mystery. And they were just dumbfounded. They had no idea what to do with that response. So they left.
It's funny because one thing I wanted to talk about that I'd love to talk about next time is my parents and I were watching some BBC show about Leonardo da Vinci. You know, that like news style where it's like that you interview like a history expert, you know, in like a 2-camera interview, and then you sort of have this other half of the program is like a reenactment, you know, like you know what I mean.
Yeah,
so we were watching one of these things, and one thing that I hadn't heard before was this sort of correlation of the arrival of the printing press, Gutenberg's press, and the fact that that idiot, like 20-year-old Ottoman kid wanted to knock over Constantinople. Like he just was determined to not, because it was a big wall, and he was like, I'm going to knock it out. So he spent like trillions of Ottoman dollars to just knock Constantinople's wall down.
Mm-hmm.
So all the monks that had the books from Alexandria, from the Library of Alexandria, all of like the math and the geometry and the stuff, they fled to Italy. And then the printing press came. And so Leonardo da Vinci, who wasn't like a really rich dude, was able to acquire 200 books by the time he died.
Mm.
And they were all from this. And so my point is that the Dark Ages came across Europe, and there was this time when in Alexandria, people kind of figured out, like, Ptolemy knew the world was round, was a sphere. Like,
Mm-hmm.
he proved it, right?
Yeah.
And then the Dark Ages come around, and you've got like the church threatening to, burn.
You mean
people
Ptolemy was part of the spherical Earth conspiracy? Is that what you're saying?
Well,
All the way back then?
Got down in the well and proved it, right? So my point was that, like,
Yeah.
the Dark Ages came,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone kind of forgot about what we had figured out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then people like Leonardo da Vinci were like, "Oh my God, have you read this book about geometry?" And like they were like discovering these ancient or very old texts and knowledge and rediscovering it is really like my point.
Yeah.
So I feel like what I wanted to talk about was this idea that, like, I kind of feel like the printing press was what's my professor, the guy that did amusing ourselves to death?
Neil Postman. Yeah.
Postman. So Postman's thing was his favorite technological communication invention was the printing press. He was like, all upside, very little downside.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we went forward technologically and innovated, he said the downside started to increase against the upsides. In other words, he would look at what we're facing, where it's, hey, let's get rid of fact checking, and let's go with community's notes for everything. Yeah. And I saw a really funny meme where someone had Mark Zuckerberg's face on it, and it was like, multiple time convicted pedophile Mark Zuckerberg decides to, and it was like, check this on the front, like community, fact check this bitch. So, but Postman, I think, would look at this moment where you've got this sort of the digital printing press or publishing platform. Yeah, like, we're podcasting right now. This is part of it. This is the printing press, like ones and zeros. It's the Gutenberg, but it seems like back then, it took so much effort to make a book. Like, you had to typeset every single letter. So people tried to make it true. Yeah. And the idea that you would make a fake news book was just like mind-boggling. Like, no one would bother, right?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Like, I think one of the things that you're making me think of is how I was listening to somebody recently talk about how each sort of major wave of culture where communication and information was more democratized, like in a big wave of that, like the printing press being one of the first, if not the first one, right? Where information was suddenly available to the masses, like it had never been before. Right. And then what followed was this era of crazy instability and revolution and all that, right? So you had revolutions across Europe pretty soon after that. And the person didn't mention this, but it's interesting to point to Russia too, and to look at, like, a little bit later, the Russian Enlightenment happened, right? You had these writers, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Chekhov and the whole wave of the Russian Enlightenment. Almost on the heels of that was Stalin and Lenin, and then Stalin, right? Like slaughter and it just really like clamping down on knowledge and intellectuals in Russia, right? Like, and seeing into that as dangerous. And so there was like the explosion, the revolution, and the backlash to the revolution, kind of, and the radio, like World War I, World War II, right? Like world wars followed radio, and then so somebody was just saying like democratizing information has. I mean, because the context of what they were talking about was just the early days of the internet and sort of the utopian kind of vision for the internet. And this consensus amongst the people sort of creating the internet and the rest of us who were experiencing it early on, this consensus that it was going to spread democracy and knowledge around the world and create this sort of enlightenment, right? And it did the opposite in a way. Like it did that sort of, but it's also done the opposite, where it's created this like platform for misinformation and propaganda, and it's created this crazy sort of dark populism, or it's not created it, but it's definitely it's amplified it or made it's a tool for that as well. So it's just interesting. Like I think the thing that I'm hearing, or the thing that when you talk about that, the thing that I think about is just like we as humans, we are dark and we are light. Like there's no such thing as good and bad people, right? We are mixes, we're complicated, and we all have a dark side. And the internet and AI and the printing press and all these things sort of like give our dark side just as much power as our light side. And so whatever is created from those things will be both dark and light, I guess.
Remember when we were talking about hormones and being a bag of chemicals sloshing back and forth? And I said, what's actually kind of miraculous or really hard to believe is how persistent our personality is over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, right. What I find interesting is that I would make an assumption that the onward, like my parents, I made a joke. This is kind of a total weave thing, but my parents this year, their landline broke, and we tried really hard to get it fixed. And I said, I'd rather it didn't get fixed, because you always are really susceptible to like phone scams. Like people call them and say, you forgot to pay your taxes, whatever. And they can call a landline much more easily than a cell phone. So the landline, and they sent a guy out, and the guy literally was like, no one really has these. Like no one really knows how to fix it, because it's
interesting.
Like, you know what I mean? Like they have this weird box, and he's like, it's voice over IP anyway. So just use FaceTime. He's like, why do you even need, you know what I mean? A landline?
Yeah.
So I was like we're leaving that broken, Mom and Dad. Like they don't know how to fix it. They don't want to fix it,
Yeah.
And so they're like, oh darn, now so-and-so can't call us. And I'm like, tell them your phone number.
Right. Like phone numbers still work.
Yeah. And so my dad uses TurboTax every year, and he still has clients and tax clients. And this year they told him no more CDs. We're not going to do CD installs. So this morning,
only this year, I was surprised that wasn't 10 years ago.
No, last year he insisted. He mailed me. He likes to share it with me. He mailed me a CD, and I was like, "What do I do with this?
What do I do with a CD?" I asked my son the other day whether he'd ever held a cassette tape, because he had to, for a play that he's in, he had to make a prop of a boombox, and he drew like a cassette tape, thing on the front. And I was just curious, like, have you ever actually even held in your hands a cassette tape? And he said no. And then he was trying to ask me how big they were and stuff, and he was asking me all these questions about a cassette tape. Anyway, continue.
Yeah. So their landline died. The CDs, and my wife and I we did a Google Hangout meeting call with my dad, and we literally like walked him through downloading the file and installing it. Like he just couldn't do it, I mean, so anyway, my point was that what I said to my parents, hey, this year is all about the end of eras. Like it's the end of landlines. It's the end of CDs. Like the cruel march forward of progress. Is
the end of democracy. There's lots of things. No, sorry, continue. Yeah.
But I was saying, like, so what was interesting to me is like, I always picture that, generation after generation, like we move, time never stops ticking, and we grow older, and then our progeny take over and they experience the world, and keeps happening generation after generation. And you imagine that some kind of wisdom that was attained at some place and time that really worked would be persistent after it was acquired. But then you look at the Ptolemy story and the Da Vinci thing, and it doesn't actually work that way. Like we really can lose it all.
We can
start over, and it's great.
And I think we're in a weird way, it's especially fragile now, because I was thinking about like pictures of my family, right? Like, and how they are. I wasn't thinking about this recently, but at one point I was thinking about, like, I have a box of photos that from my high school years and stuff, pictures I took and I had printed, and and people shared with me in physical form, like on paper, printed photos, right? And then I was thinking about like my pictures of my kids. Right? They're all on a drive somewhere. and backed up on several drives. But like, if we had, I was just imagining like the sort of the apocalypse scenario, right? Like if civilization was sort of wiped out, right? And we were in one of those movies where civilization is, we're in, you know, like the Walking Dead, right? You would have no pictures of your family except for from 5 generations ago.
Right.
So like, I would have the paper pictures from 2 or 3 generations ago. I would have no pictures of my own kids. It would all disappear, even though there's thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures compared to what was existing of my childhood. It would all be gone.
And what's interesting from a risk assessment is that the paper copies, like, you know, look at the LA fires. Like we didn't expect that to happen. Like you could lose the paper copies in a fire, but an electromagnetic pulse from a solar flare could wipe out like every hard drive on the planet, and we would be like, oh shit, you know.
Shit. Yeah, like I have that one album I printed of my kids' photos that I made, you know, for Lonnie years ago, and that'd be it, right?
You could burn everything to a DVD if you bought a DVD player, you know, like an optical disc. You know?
Yeah.
Non-magnetic optical disc.
I mean, I do have it on a local drive. I could hook it up to a computer if I had power, but it's just kind of wild to think about, like how much information that we have, more information by orders and orders of magnitude today, just stored on things than we've ever had digital information. And it's more fragile than any other era of information has ever been. So it's just what you're saying is absolutely true. Yeah. We could lose it all very easily. I mean, so I guess a wrap up question, if we're ready to kind of wrap it up. And so since we're talking about the apocalypse type of thing, one of the weird things I think about is like, what would my post-apocalypse skill be for myself? Like I was thinking, like, if I were trying to survive in the Walking Dead world, and I'm wandering alone, and I see some people. So, because it's always people that you're afraid of in those movies. Like the zombies are bad, but like you also are afraid of people, right? They don't want you to be competing for resources with them, right? So in order to keep them from killing me, I would have to, like, I can't be a product manager, right? In the post-apocalyptic world. They just like, right? They just shoot me immediately and maybe eat me, right? So at best, all I would be for them was a meal if they were desperate. So I was thinking, like, what would I do? What should I learn today so that I could immediately say, hey, don't kill me. I can do this for you. And I was thinking, like, maybe like whiskey, like if I learned to distill alcohol.
Yeah.
I don't know. That was my thought. I mean, you could be a minstrel. You could be like a minstrel. You have like musical skills that I don't have. You could be
you can sing, man. You don't have to play the guitar. You can just sing with it. Really. But I do think it's a good, interesting point. I've actually thought a little bit about this. Like I try not to consider myself a prepper. Like I don't actually go out and buy things and like have like a safe room in the house. But I think about it. I like to be prepared, you know, as a Boy Scout.
Yeah.
And but I do think like there's certain things that I think we should all learn how to make fire without a match.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
I think flint and steel, like, I don't know if I'm ever going to like really rely. I think that I would just make sure I had a flint and steel. I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, I think the bow drill technique, I mean,
it could be taken away from you.
It's worth learning. Yeah.
If you were like robbed by this roving gang, they would take the flint and steel, and then you'd be
totally would. Absolutely.
It'd be nice to like at least try it once, you know. Like
No, you're right. We should all learn that.
And then the second thing, this is an odd one, but I think it would be easy to do. We could do it like while we're brushing our teeth. I think we should all learn Morse code. Oh. I think Morse code would be important, and I think for instance, in the missile silo in Tucson, it's the what's the name of that museum? Titan Missile Museum in Tucson. They have all of these redundant antennas in case they get knocked over, and then they have this fail-safe backup one that's like in Dune. It's the thumper. It's just a thumper, and it's like this thing that's in the ground and it goes like that, and it can and you can actually
the thing that attracted the worms.
Yeah, and you can actually pick up the signal through the crust of the Earth in Washington, D.C. from that
Wow.
silo.
Huh.
But it would only really work with Morse code. So I think like
Yeah.
Morse code will come in handy at some point if there's a apocalyptic thing.
Yeah.
The ability to communicate very simply with just dot, 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 dash, dash, dash. So I think that's one thing I told the kids we should all try to, just as a family, learn it, just so that we could.
That's a bit prepper of you, to be honest.
It is. But then there's the,
I mean, maybe that's the most prepper that you get. Maybe that's it.
That story of the Navy that they have this idea like it would be fairly easy to set off, an explosion that was like a shrapnel-based weapon at the level of GPS satellites. So if you send up something
just
to that
wipe
level,
out all the satellites.
you just take them out because it's 1,000 miles an hour, some like chunk of metal.
Kind of like in that movie Gravity, where they get, was it Gravity, where they get hit by space debris, or like
it's very dangerous.
And like it just shreds their.
It cuts through everything,
Yeah.
So the Russians are developing a weapon that could theoretically take out all GPS satellites in 24 hours. And so the Navy realized that no one in the Navy, none of the captains know how to use an astrolabe.
Oh.
So they went and found this old dude.
Like celestial navigation would be an interesting thing to know for the post-apocalyptic world.
Super important to know because you can get around with the stars, right?
Right. Yeah, that would be a good one.
Yeah. Especially if you were going to try to make it to Hawaii or something on a
yeah. I was about to digress into something really interesting about Polynesian sailors, but I won't right now because we're at
an hour 15. An hour 15. Yeah. This is a really fun one. I think a lot of the urge to do the podcast built up over the break. So
for sure. Yeah, it's great to see you. Happy New Year.
To see you too. Happy New Year. Happy New Year to you too. And
with your haircut. You got a fresh new haircut to start the year.
This is actually Medellin or Rio Negro.
Very distinguished looking. Yeah.
Yep. My wife was really angry because they charged me twice as much as they charged her brother.
Oh, this was in Bogota Medellin.
Kind of outside of Medellin.
Yeah.
And so she came, like she said, "Don't pay." So I'm sitting there at the counter, and the woman's like, "It's it's this much, 160 mil."
You got the gringo surcharge.
So she comes up and she's like, and then she's arguing back and forth. And basically, like he charged me to put wax in my ears and then pull it out really quick, but he didn't do that.
Oh.
And so he's like, "Well, I'll do it now." And she's like, "No, I can hear you." And then we just walked away. It was pretty funny, but
that's it. I always appreciate that about being a tourist traveling with a local person, is that they would get so incensed if somebody tried to rip you off. So you have you have that as a wife, and Huli is, your wife is, she's.
I think she was extra mad because she came with me and asked a bunch of questions. So he knew that I was married to a local.
Right.
And then he overcharged me, and then she was like, "What the fuck? Like, I already,
dude.
I'm not."
I wouldn't want to get on your wife's bad side. She's tough when she wants to be.
She does this Brazilian thing when she went to school in Brazil for a year, and she goes like this when she's really mad. She goes,
Love it.
I love it. It's so Italian. Okay, we got to go, but let's talk next week.
Yeah. Do you have a first world problem you want to end with, or do you want to just
totally?
So
my first world problem is so I've come down here a bunch. I mean, you came to the wedding, and we were actually thinking a lot about, we were touring around, and we didn't get on a party bus, but we were thinking about, we went to the lights that you went to, and we didn't go to Cartagena. But every time I come, I struggle a little bit with SIM cards and contacting my bank, and this sort of that weird thing.
Yeah.
So this time I thought I was ultra slick. I have a new iPhone with an eSIM, 2 eSIMs, and I got this eSIM thing where you install it yourself, and it's super easy and worked perfectly. But then I go to contact my bank on the app, and I have Face ID set up on the app, and it goes, "Hey, we'd like you to log in one more time since we see you're traveling."
Oh no.
Before you let you use Face ID. And I was like, that's kind of weird because the Face ID should be,
it should be more secure than logging in. Yeah.
Yeah. So then they say, so we're going to send a secret code to your phone. And I was like, you can't receive. It's really hard to get a 3-4 digit code sent to SMS to your phone when you're using like weird networks. Like it doesn't always work,
Okay.
Plus, if I want to get on to my
Right.
phone, I
Right.
have to pay $12 to just have the day rate, so I was like,
Yeah.
they canceled our plane. It's like 10 p.m. I wanted to get a hotel room. I wanted to like look and see if I had a lot of points. So
Yeah.
it's such a first world problem because no matter what I did, like I
Mm-hmm.
went to the Verizon used to have a thing where you could get all your SMS on the My SMS app or something. They closed
Yeah.
that down. And now I looked up Chase doesn't let you use Authenticator or email
Oh my God.
verification. And
Yeah.
all the travelers in the forums are like, this is so stupid. Why can't, And I
Yeah.
thought that's going to be my first world problem. Like I feel blocked by all of these weird,
I've been involved in so many battles over the years between there's the forces of security
Mhm.
and the forces of ease of use that are
Right,
always
totally.
doing battle with
Yeah.
each other. Like the easier you
Vodafone,
make
right.
something, the less secure it is
Right.
and the more
Right.
hackable it is, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
there's always these battles that go on inside tech companies between the security people and the ease of use people, and trying to figure out where to draw those battle lines.
Yeah. Because I'm not so angry that I'm going to like find another bank, but it's
Yeah.
really annoying as a traveler to not be able to get on the app with your Face ID,
What's sort of the thing that is responsible for all that is assholes that hack stuff, right? Like if those people didn't exist,
Yeah.
then those scenarios those battles wouldn't even need to be fought, right? Like that they wouldn't need to worry about that level of security if there weren't assholes out there trying to hack into your stuff, which sucks.
And I know this is like the annex addendum to our podcast, but I love having this conversation, so I'm going to keep going. But
Yeah.
one thing, how I've often said like, what percentage of culpability did the dinosaurs have for their demise? And then you say, what percentage of culpability might we have for our demise?
Yeah.
And you have to
100% almost. No, not 100%, but yeah.
If you pull back the judgment, like, we're judging that we don't like what's happening and we're uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of amazing that this one species could rise up and sort of wreck its own experience of the world.
Yeah.
It's kind of in such a short amount of time, like in the Industrial Revolution.
Very short. Yeah.
Such a short amount of time. It's kind of a phenomenal feat. And yes, it's sad and it doesn't have a lot of hope, but it's kind of just didactically, empirically amazing. I also find the fact that hackers, when you make a system that's complex and, as you say, like as the ease of use rises and my ability to contact my bank across 3,000 miles, I'm impressed by our ability to do that. But then, in some ways, what's amazing is that that people have always robbed each other.
Yeah.
But the ability for people to innovate ways of robbing people, like you see this like you make a super secure system.
I envy that mindset sometimes. Like I don't have that mindset where I think, like when you encounter these amazing scams that people devise that are really ingenious, I'm sometimes envious of people that are able to think of the hack to that level of complexity.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, and spammers too, it's another category of assholes like that has been enabled, or like it's sort of a different category of thievery, I guess, in a way. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, they're stealing your time, really, is what they're stealing.
Yeah. Well, and they're fishing for a click, maybe that might get them access to something. But yeah.
Right. No, it's true. And every time I walked through with my dad this when he was downloading the software. So he bought it from Amazon and he couldn't find it. He was like, it's not on my computer. And I bought it. And so I said, okay, well, it's a digital download. So let's go to your Amazon account. So it said my orders and it said, how do I access my stuff? You click and it has a list of instructions like number 1, go to www.installturbotax.com. So my dad goes up to the browser and types install space turbo. And 12 things drop. So it results and he clicks on one. And he clicks on one, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, Dad, let's stop and do a lesson. This is how you get scammed, because they gave you exactly where to go. They said www.installturbotax.com, no spaces.
Right.
And you typed a search term. And I said, when I was in the Dominican Republic, I got scammed. You have to pay to leave the Dominican Republic.
Yeah. Okay.
Like $10.
Yeah.
And you have to go to I want to leave DominicanRepublic.gov. And so I typed, I want to leave Dominican, and it said .com, and they spoofed the site. And I gave them
Oh shit.
everything. I gave them my
Yeah.
passport number, my credit card.
Oh my God.
You know what I mean? And,
Yeah.
and I canceled that credit card right away. But
Yeah.
I was like, whoa, it's not that hard. Like, I consider myself, I'm a digital marketer. Like, I should know.
Yeah.
But I watched my dad do it, and I was like, that's how it works. Because someone spoofs install TurboTax. Right. And then someone like my dad, they say, oh, you have to put in your credit card in order to access these features. So, and put in your password and give us your Intuit account. You know what I mean? Like, it's so easy to, once you get someone who thinks they're on the right site, or download this worm. You know what I mean? Because you're supposed to download it.
Yeah.
So it was pretty interesting as an exercise, just to watch how elderly people are. I mean, we're all susceptible, but especially elderly people with computers are just so vulnerable.
I know. I worry about my mom. All right, so I'll do a first world problem. Real quick. So mine is that how hard it is to not use Amazon and Spotify and these other things that I don't want to use, but I'm like,
like, it's bad for the economy of that thing, but
it's bad for, like Spotify is just a dick company to artists, right? It's more and more like if they didn't have to pay artists, they wouldn't, right? But like I have my whole family on Spotify, and I don't want to do a different thing and try to figure out how to, I don't know. And I feel like I got to find a way to use Spotify where my own way of using it is healthy. I feel like there's ways that you can do, like the more and more they're making background music, like this sort of factory, and it'll be all AI at some point, like lo-fi beats and focus music and that kind of shit, right? That's all going to be AI at some point, because, and I get it from Spotify's perspective. Like if their model is to pay artists per stream, right? Like you listen to music in different ways. Like if you're listening to an artist, like you put in a CD of, Nico Case or Calexico or something, right? That's one way of listening to music. If you put in lo-fi beats so that you can have a dentist office that's just like, it's just in the background, it kind of doesn't make sense for Spotify to pay all those lo-fi beats people the same as they're paying Nico Case, because if you're just running a dentist office and it's just like, I get that Spotify doesn't want to treat those things the same, but like just generating, I don't know, creating a scam. Anyway, so I won't go on a whole thing, but using Spotify, I wish it was easier to stop. And Amazon Prime and these other things, like it's just so convenient. It's hard to stop using it.
I was thinking about, because I have the same just deep, especially since I really don't like both sort of politically and I just don't like the owners of some of these companies.
Exactly.
So I was thinking, like, in some ways, all Amazon is a Sears catalog with a website.
Yeah.
Because if you were like a pioneer, like in 1862, and you could buy anything in the Sears catalog and have it delivered to you. And
let me tell you a story about Amazon from 2006. Like when I knew that it was over for big bookstores like Borders, right? There was a Borders bookstore in Union Square in San Francisco. And I worked a block away, not even a block away, half a block away from that Borders bookstore, right? And we would go to that Borders Cafe and get coffee every single day. But when we ordered books, when we wanted a book, we still ordered from Amazon, half a block away from the Borders bookstore.
Wow. Yeah.
Because the chances that they had the specific book you were looking for, the effort it would take to go there and find it was even half a block away was more than it took to find it on Amazon and just do a click, right? And so I just thought stores like that are fucked. Like, and it's actually interesting to see that independent bookstores thrive because the process is different. If you wanted to browse for books, if you wanted to go and like, hey, I'm looking for something to read, what's good? Like going to Borders would be a reason to do that.
Way
like
more
browse.
fun,
Yeah. But like if you're like, hey, I need this book on, whatever, you know exactly what book you want. Like you're not going to go into Borders and look for that book. So it's very interesting because I remember feeling like watching my coworkers order books from Amazon instead of walking, and even though they had just been in the store to get coffee.
Right.
Yeah, it's
No,
crazy.
I know exactly what you mean. Wow. Well, I wonder how we can, like the revolution will not be televised. That's what they say, right?
Yeah.
It's an interesting time. I'm looking forward to our next couple of pods because a lot's going to change over the next few weeks.
Satellites? A satellite represents a journey, information gathering, this journey around the Earth.